So if you've ever sat in a local school board meeting and just watched people absolutely fight over, property tax funding or vocational tracking or even what history is allowed to be taught in the classroom, um, you might think you're watching a modern debate.
Right. It feels very much of the moment.
Exactly. It feels like it's happening right now. But what if I told you that you were actually watching an argument that was scripted like over 130 years ago?
It is a wild thing to think about.
It really is. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we are opening up the vault on a very specific historical gathering. We're looking at how the foundational structure of the American educational system for Black citizens, how it wasn't actually formed by some massive public clash of civil rights titans out in the open.
Which is the narrative we usually get.
Right, but rather that it was quietly engineered by a really small group of white industrialists in a private resort in upstate New York in June of 1890.
Yeah, over 100 of the wealthiest, most powerful white men in America retreating to the Smiley family's Lake Mohonk estate. And they weren't there for a summer vacation.
No, definitely not.
They were there to quietly draft the blueprint for exactly what and how Black Americans would be allowed to learn for the next century. It completely shifts the lens on how we view the origin of these systems.
It really does. So our goal for you today is to explore how the educational condition of African-descended people in the U.S. was, according to our sources, shaped by design, not by accident.
And we have a really fascinating stack of sources to guide us through this.
We do.
The central document is a comparative research analysis by Jimma Maat Dogon McWilson. What McWilson does is act as this analytical bridge between two highly specific, really dense texts that are separated by more than a century.
Right, so the first text is basically the raw historical blueprint. It's the First Mohonk Conference on the Negro Question from 1890.
Yeah, that's the one.
It's this 152-page primary record, edited by Isabel Chapin Barrows, and it just documents that entire three-day gathering of white elites.
And then the second text is the scholarly autopsy of that blueprint. It's a book called The White Architects of Black Education.
That's by William H. Watkins, right?
Exactly. A critique written by Watkins, published by Teachers College Press in 2001.
Okay, so before we jump in, we just want to be super clear with you, the listener. These sources present a deeply critical framework.
Very critical.
And our goal on this deep dive is not to take a political side or endorse one ideology over another or, cast modern judgments on historical actors.
Right. Our job is just to rigorously unpack the specific claims made in these documents. We were examining how these texts argue that historical philanthropy essentially masked a vast project of social engineering. We're relying strictly on the analysis presented by McWilson and Watkins.
Exactly. Because if you want to understand modern debates about school funding, curriculum, and educational access, this analysis argues you really have to look at these historical blueprints.
You can't understand the house if you don't know who poured the foundation, right?
That is exactly it. So let's look at that foundation. To understand how a few private individuals could essentially rewrite educational policy for an entire demographic, we first have to understand the specific historical window that allowed it to happen.
The timing here is absolutely crucial.
Right, because we all know the political vacuum that followed the collapse of Reconstruction in 1877. The federal troops pull out of the South.
Yeah, and Watkins argues that while historians were mostly watching the political fallout of that, white industrialists saw an unregulated void.
An unregulated void, that's a great way to put it.
Watkins frames this specific time frame, kind of bracketing it from 1865 all the way to 1954, as a period where white elites stepped directly into that void.
Because there's no federal oversight anymore.
Exactly. The source notes the Mohonk Conference is convened in 1890, which is precisely when Black political rights are being systematically dismantled.
Right, through disenfranchisement and violence all across the South.
Without federal protection for Black civil rights, these elites could impose an educational agenda essentially unopposed.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it's a huge claim. As the federal troops pull out and the political protections just evaporate, capital steps in.
It's exactly what happened, according to Watkins.
It's like tearing down a community-built house, leaving the residents entirely out in the cold, and then a group of very wealthy contractors swoops in. They claim to be rescuing everyone, but they only build houses with no doors on the inside.
That's a really good analogy.
Right. Like, you have shelter, you can get in the front door, but you cannot advance from room to room. You are stuck exactly where they put you.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture that Watkins is painting, the retreat of the federal government was the very mechanism that empowered these new architects to take control.
They needed the vacuum.
They absolutely needed it to build their version of the future.
The Mohonk Conference wasn't just a passive reaction to the end of Reconstruction.
What was it then? It was an active consolidation of the new Jim Crow-era power dynamics. It was an offensive move to lock Black Americans into economic subservience.
But if these wealthy industrialists were taking advantage of this political vacuum to impose a system of economic subservience, I mean, how did they convince the wider public, and maybe even themselves, that this was a noble charity rather than a hostile takeover?
That is where the PR spin comes in.
Yeah, that requires a massive PR spin. Because they didn't frame it as an oppression strategy. They framed Black existence in America as a quote-unquote problem that they, the enlightened elites, needed to solve.
The language they used is really the ideological scaffolding for the entire project. I mean, look at the title of the 1890 document itself.
First Mohonk Conference on the Negro Question.
Right. Both McWilson's analysis and Watkins' book point out that this phrase, the Negro question, or sometimes you'd hear the Negro problem, it was a heavily coded euphemism.
A euphemism for what?
Well, by phrasing it as a question or a problem, white society was basically framing Black freedom, citizenship, and education as something that had to be managed by white institutions.
Wow. So it shifts the narrative completely away from honoring a fundamental human right, and it turns it into an administrative burden.
Exactly. An administrative burden that just happens to require their expert intervention.
Right, because if someone is a problem, then you get to play the role of the solver. And that brings in this really heavy blanket of paternalism.
It does, and the texts do an excellent job of breaking down this white paternalism.
Let's talk about that, because the participants at Mohonk, they weren't just business tycoons, right? They were reformers, politicians, prominent clergy members.
Yeah, and the documents suggest they genuinely believed they were acting benevolently. They were using all this rhetoric of uplift and civilization.
But Watkins pushes back on that.
Heavily. Watkins' 2001 critique argues that this language of benevolence merely masked a deeper, much more calculated project.
Which is what?
Labor management and social control.
Okay, wait, hold on. I have to ask. We're talking about abolitionists and clergy here. Are the sources actually claiming these reformers sat in a smoky room, rubbing their hands together like cartoon villains, fully aware they were building a cage?
It's a fair question.
Or did they truly, in their hearts, believe they were building a ladder for people?
So the analysis references scholar Lizana D. Kazembe to answer exactly this. Kazembe scrutinizes the psychology of these quote-unquote Mohonkers.
Okay, what does he say?
He points out that this paternalism was actually driven by collective anxiety.
Anxiety? Really?
Yeah, he argues it was rooted in a deep-seated fear and loathing of Black social advancement. So their benevolence was really a psychological cover for what was essentially a colonial-style control mechanism.
They wanted to control the pace of change.
Exactly. They wanted integration, sure, but only on highly managed subservient terms.
So the uplift was real, but only up to the second floor.
Right, never to the penthouse.
Never to the penthouse.
Yeah.
You know, McWilson's analysis highlights how Watkins describes General Samuel Chapman Armstrong.
He was a massive figure at this conference.
Right. And Watkins describes his specific form of racial accommodation. Watkins says Armstrong's rhetoric sounded like unity in diversity, but in practice, it demanded absolute racial subservience.
It sounded good on paper.
But it was just PR for subjugation.
And honestly, nothing illustrates this managed paternalistic approach better than looking at who was actually invited to the table to discuss this so-called question.
Oh my gosh, yes. This is the most glaring, almost darkly comedic irony of the entire 1890 conference.
It really is.
Because if the whole goal of your three-day retreat is to discuss the future of Black Americans, you know, their education, their labor, their status, you would obviously assume Black Americans would be front and center at the conference.
You would think so.
But the source details this incredible absurdity. You have over 100 northern and southern elites gathered at a private, secluded New York resort to debate the lives of millions of people with a near total exclusion of Black voices.
It's a profound structural exclusion. The Mohonk Conference was a largely white affair.
Which just speaks volumes.
It does, because you don't invite the problem to help write the solution if you fundamentally believe the problem is incapable of self-determination.
Wow. Yeah, that perfectly sums up the paternalism we were just talking about. But there was one dissenting voice mentioned in the text, wasn't there? Albion W. Tourget.
Yes, Tourget. He was a Reconstruction advocate, a lawyer, and a writer.
And he was actually at Mohonk.
He was. And he delivered an address at the conference titled The Negro's View of the Race Problem.
Okay, so he tried to bring that perspective in.
He did. He actively called out the Assembly's paternalism right to their faces. He actually proposed a resolution to change their approach and specifically include black perspectives in these policy decisions.
Let me guess, it didn't go over well.
Not at all. The resolution completely failed to gain support.
Wow, they just shut him down.
Effectively, yes. He was silenced by the overwhelming consensus of the room. The white architects were simply not interested in sharing the drafting table.
You know, this detail about deliberate exclusion completely shatters the standard historical narrative that I think most of us grew up with.
What's fascinating here is how Watkins deconstructs that exact myth.
Right, because most of us are taught that the entire course of black education in America was shaped by the great debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois.
The classic accommodationist versus the radical debate.
Exactly. We study their letters, we read their speeches, we look at their differing philosophies, as if they were the primary ones charting the course of history.
Watkins's text just destroys this myth entirely.
How so?
He argues that both Washington and Du Bois were actually minor players compared to the white architects pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Minor players.
Yeah.
That is a wild reframing.
It is, because the real power didn't lie in the philosophical debate between black intellectuals. It lay in the checkbooks of white industrialists.
It's like we've spent a century analyzing this intense, high-stakes chess match between two brilliant players, Washington and Du Bois, only for Watkins' book to reveal that someone else entirely owned the board, manufactured the pieces, and wrote the rule book in a private resort in New York before the players even sat down to play.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. Because if Washington and Du Bois didn't control the board, we have to look at who did.
And how private individuals wielded so much power over what really should be a public good.
Right. We're talking about philanthropy functioning as de facto public policy.
The source gives us the names of these power brokers, too. Watkins identifies key figures like General Samuel Chapman Armstrong, who we mentioned, J.L.N. Curry, William Baldwin, Robert Ogden, Thomas Jesse Jones.
These were the men with the capital.
And they exercised immense power through these massive foundations.
The analysis highlights several of these financial behemoths. You have the Slater Fund, the Peabody Fund, the Rockefeller General Education Board, and the Phelps-Stokes Fund.
These are big names.
Huge names. And they weren't just writing small charity checks to help out a local schoolhouse.
What were they doing?
According to Watkins, they wielded government-like power, but they were accountable only to themselves.
Okay, this is a terrifying concept for a listener today to grasp. How exactly does a private foundation wield government-like power over public schools? Are they like lobbying politicians, or is it a more direct financial chokehold?
It was a very direct financial mechanism. They deployed their immense capital to basically force compliance.
Give me an example of how that worked.
Well, imagine a foundation like the Peabody Fund. They would approach a really cash-strapped Southern school district and offer them a massive grant.
Which the district obviously needs.
Desperately. But the foundation would write in a strict condition regarding the curriculum. If the school wanted to teach classical subjects like philosophy or higher math, they lost the funding entirely.
Wow, so they just starved out any curriculum they didn't like.
Exactly. Through sheer financial leverage, these private, totally unaccountable funds dictated educational policy across the entire region.
That is chilling.
And Watkins goes a step further. He frames this entire philanthropic endeavor as an internal colonial project.
Internal colonialism. Okay, we usually think of colonialism in terms of, a foreign power conquering a sovereign nation overseas, extracting resources, imposing its own administrators. How does Watkins apply that framework here inside the United States?
He argues it was a relationship administered by unequal parties, which perfectly mirrors the colonial dynamic.
Because one side has all the money.
Exactly. The more powerful group, these white elites and their foundation money, they set the terms of the relationship. They dictated the curriculum, defined the limits of aspiration, and established the acceptable boundaries of social change for what was essentially a subject people.
They used their wealth to colonize the minds and futures of Black Americans.
Yes. to ensure the black population remained an exploitable resource for the nation's industrial expansion.
So if they are using these massive financial levers to force a specific curriculum on these schools, we really need to look at what exactly that curriculum is, because they didn't just hand over the money and say, go learn whatever you want.
No, the mechanism they chose is perhaps the most critical part of this entire analysis. It all comes back to industrial education.
Right. And both the 1890 conference document and Watkins's 2001 book converge on this exact point.
At the 1890 Mohonk Conference, General Armstrong actually delivered a keynote address explicitly advocating for industrial training.
And the conference heavily endorsed this as the one true path, right?
Yes, they went all in on it.
But by universally endorsing industrial schools, these philanthropists were deliberately foreclosing the option of liberal arts and classical education for Black Americans.
That was the point.
They were deciding that Black students did not need to learn philosophy or advanced mathematics or literature or political science.
To understand why this was so damaging, you have to look at what industrial education was actually designed to achieve in this context.
Okay, what does Watkins say it was designed to achieve?
He argues it was systematically designed to cut off intellectual liberation.
Here's where I can hear the pushback from people listening to this. Because, wait, learning a trade is generally seen as a good thing.
Of course.
We talk all the time today about the importance of vocational schools, plumbing, electricity, carpentry. These are great careers. How exactly does the source differentiate between learning a useful skill to make a living and being subjected to social control?
That's a vital distinction, and the text clarifies this. The issue, according to Watkins, wasn't the trade itself.
Right.
There's nothing inherently oppressive about learning agriculture or carpentry. The issue was the limit of aspiration.
Ah, okay. The limit of aspiration.
Yes, industrial training was enforced as the only acceptable path.
It wasn't an option, it was a mandate.
Exactly. If you only teach someone to labor with their hands, and you explicitly deny them the critical thinking tools needed to analyze their society, you ensure they cannot challenge the social order.
The curriculum itself was the cage.
It was.
It wasn't about building Black wealth or giving people economic independence. Here's where it gets really interesting. Watkins concludes that industrial education was explicitly designed to control, pacify, and socialize subject people.
Pacification is the key word there.
Right. To ensure they remained a massive, cheap labor force for the very industrial capitalism these philanthropists profited from.
It was an educational model perfectly designed to produce a compliant working class.
They didn't want to educate citizens?
No, because citizens might demand the right to vote or equal protection under the law. They wanted to train a workforce that would just run the machinery and accept their subordinate position without complaint.
It is absolutely staggering to trace that line from a private resort in 1890 directly into the classrooms of the 20th century.
It really makes you rethink everything.
It does. Which brings us to why McWilson argues this historical autopsy is vital for you, the listener, right now.
Because it's not just history.
Exactly. McWilson's preamble explicitly states that the exclusion, the underfunding, the segregation, and the ideological management of Black education did not end with Jim Crow.
They didn't disappear. They just evolved.
They evolved into modern forms. The past isn't just some distant historical curiosity. It remains highly active in the present.
And when you look at modern disparities, McWilson connects this history directly to contemporary debates.
Like what?
Like arguments today around school funding models that are tied to local property taxes, or the outsized role of private billionaire foundations that are currently influencing public school policy.
Wow, yes. The philanthropic influence is still huge today.
Exactly. The texts argue that these modern issues are the direct legacy of Mohonk.
So what does this all mean for us? McWilson argues that this comparative analysis is a method of intellectual clarification.
Reading these two texts together isn't just an academic exercise.
No, it helps us see the systemic root of the problem. Because if you don't know that the system was actually designed to produce inequality, you might mistakenly believe the system is just broken.
Right. You might think it's just malfunctioning.
But it's not. It's functioning exactly as it was built to function.
And this is where McWilson highlights the more optimistic turn in the source material.
Oh, there's optimism here.
There is. Because if these inequities were historically produced, meaning they were made by people with specific agendas at specific times, they can be historically understood.
And therefore, deliberately transformed.
Exactly. True solutions, according to the text, require reclaiming historical truth. They require centering African agency, which, as we saw, was so deliberately excluded at Mohonk.
Right.
And it requires building educational models based on self-knowledge and liberation rather than just accommodation.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today on this deep dive.
We really have.
Unpacking the coded language of paternalism, revealing the hidden hands of these philanthropic architects, and examining how curriculum was actively used as a tool for labor control.
It's a lot to process.
It is. Moving from seeing education as a purely neutral public good to understanding it as a highly managed political proposition is a massive shift in perspective. But I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this intense intellectual journey.
And before we go, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought, inspired by our sources, stretching into your immediate reality.
Go for it.
If the philanthropic architects of 1890 successfully designed an educational system specifically to socialize a workforce, limit aspiration, and suppress dissent, well, you have to ask yourself. When you look at the standardized tests, the rigid schedules, and the funding models of the schools in your own community today, whose economic interest is that, quote-unquote, normal routine still quietly serving?
That is a question that will stick with you. Keep questioning the blueprints of the world around you, everyone, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.